Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of this literary festival. I'm an economist by training, and certainly listening to the previous talk has really carried one on a certain trajectory of thinking, from where to talk about what I am going to talk would require collecting my thoughts. So I would crave your indulgence if I develop my ideas in a manner that is not exactly perfectly coherent. Typically, capitalism has always been seen as a modernizing force that basically, compared to feudal societies which were characterized by hierarchies, capitalism has always been seen as the intrusion of a new society that brings about equality among the individuals, that brings about a notion of citizenship, and therefore that has been seen as a harbinger of a democratic revolution in society. Now, this is in fact the role that capitalism had played originally in countries in Europe like Britain and France, both of which had bourgeois revolutions. The French bourgeois revolution had brought to the fore ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the English Revolution of 1840 had likewise projected the power of the Parliament against the king. And even though monarchy remained in an attenuated form as a constitutional monarchy, nonetheless, essentially, power had shifted to the Parliament, and through the Parliament to the people, and notions of equality tended to develop from there. Now, it is also well known that societies that come late to capitalism, societies like ours, societies like Eastern Europe or in other third world countries, the whole trajectory of development is somewhat different. Lenin wrote about it, and he actually presented a picture where the argument was that in these societies that come late to capitalism, because capitalism itself is challenged, because it is already facing a socialist threat, the bourgeoisie in these countries does not deal massive blows against feudalism, but rather tends to make compromises with the landlord elements, with the feudal elements, because they are afraid that an attack on landed property might rebound into an attack on bourgeois property. As a result, Lenin's argument, put forward, for instance, in Two Tactics on Social Democracy, was that in these societies, the attack on landed interests, the attack on landed property, the attack on feudalism cannot be led by the bourgeoisie, but in fact can only be led by a working class which has to ally itself with the peasantry in order to realize the peasantry's aspirations for a space against the old feudal lords. So Lenin's argument was that basically in these societies, the democratic revolution can only be carried forward not by the bourgeoisie anymore, but it can be carried forward by the working class. And if the working class is carrying forward the democratic revolution, the working class, having carried out a democratic revolution, doesn't just stop at building socialism, then it goes on to building, doesn't just stop at building capitalism, it goes on to building socialism. So the whole argument was that in societies like ours, or in societies coming late to capitalism, the revolutionary role of capitalism no longer exists, that basically now in these kinds of societies, really democratic revolution is itself a part of the socialist revolution. And this was, of course, the kind of thought that sustained the entire left movement for 100 years. For the last 1 century, the basic theory which has animated the left, including in our country, has been a theory where the democratic revolution is one which can only be carried forward into a socialist revolution. The idea of a democratic revolution ushered in by capitalism, which then gives equality to all citizens and so on, is something which is no longer possible in our historical context. This much is fairly clear. The question arises that Lenin was writing in a particular context. What was that context? That context was where Tsarism existed, feudalism existed, and there was a bourgeois-led movement against it and a working class-led movement against it, and the idea was what is the relationship between the two. Lenin's argument was, therefore, that it is the working class-led movement that will not make compromises, while the bourgeois-led movement will make compromises. Therefore, the working class-led movement is something that should not have alliances with the bourgeois-led movement, because that is going to hold back the democratic revolution. So the context was one where feudalism existed, and the point was which of the forces struggling against feudalism is in fact the genuine force that would carry the democratic revolution forward. But today in societies like ours, that moment is gone. And therefore, the question is, we are no longer at a moment when there are two different kinds of movements which are combating or which are standing against feudalism. That might have been the case in the 1940s or the 1930s, but today we are in a world in which capitalism has already, that the bourgeoisie is already in power. That basically that Leninist moment is gone, the bourgeoisie is in power, and when the bourgeoisie comes into power, makes an alliance against feudal elements, what happens to the democratic revolution? That's the question which I'm going to discuss. In other words, the moment we go beyond the Leninist moment, then what exactly happens to the democratic revolution? And I'm going to argue that in these societies where the bourgeoisie has come to power, where the bourgeoisie is building capitalism, where in these societies the bourgeoisie has made compromises with the feudal elements, with feudal structures, in these kinds of societies, you actually have not only that the democratic revolution not carried forward, but you actually have a rolling back of the democratic revolution. You actually have a social retrogression, and such social retrogression leads to a social disintegration of the kind that we are witnessing in our country today. That's the point which I want to develop. Now, we all know that the kind of institutionalized inequality that existed in this country is almost without a parallel anywhere else in the world. You had untouchability in Kerala, you had unseeability, unbelievable levels of institutionalized inequality existed in this country, in our society, in our traditional society. It is often believed, and many people like Arundhati Roy and others have argued, that really colonialism played a role in destroying this, because colonialism brought with it the idea of juridical equality, equality before law, all of which were fundamentally antithetical to this idea of institutionalized inequality. Now, while there is no doubt that colonialism did bring the concept of juridical equality, at the same time, its impact at the ground level was limited. In fact, two things happened under colonialism. Firstly, its impact at the ground level was limited, because of which, no matter what the statutes provided, you actually had a situation where Dalits were not allowed to draw water from common water sources. All over North India, they were not allowed to own land. And consequently, the whole idea of there being any genuine ground level progress towards social equality did not exist under colonialism, even though it's a fact that the notions of juridical equality were brought here from outside. The second thing that happened is that the whole impact of colonialism through the processes of drain of wealth and deindustrialization basically resulted in a generation of mass poverty, in the generation of unemployment, in the generation of a crowding of people in the labor market, leading to a lowering of real wages through 19th century, whose worst victims were the Dalits. In other words, this kind of colonial exploitation at the economic level had its worst victims among precisely those who were the poorest, who were the laborers, who were the Dalits. Therefore, at one level, colonialism meant an economic exploitation to a heightened degree upon those who are socially the most oppressed, and at another level, even such ideas of juridical equality that colonialism brought did not really help them out of their social predicament. Now, therefore, really it is not colonialism, but really the anti-colonial struggle that has to be seen as the beginning of India's democratic revolution. That really the awakening, the tendency towards assertion by the socially oppressed begins not with colonialism, but with the anti-colonial struggle. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were characterized by two great struggles in India. One, of course, was the anti-colonial struggle, and the other was the social emancipation struggle of Periyar, Phule, Ambedkar, Narayan Guru, and others. Now, these two struggles are often seen in distinction, even in contradiction with one another. The fact that people like Gandhiji, even though they believed in egalitarianism, nonetheless accepted the caste system in some form, on the one hand, and the fact that on the other hand, you had people like Periyar and Ambedkar and so on, who really distanced themselves from the anti-colonial struggle, has led many people to argue that really these two struggles stood in contradiction to one another. That there really was two completely separate struggles whose leaders certainly were not even in great kind of sympathy towards one another. I would like to suggest that this is not the case, in the sense that while this is certainly factually true, at the ground level, there was a complementarity between these two struggles. That those who were engaged in the anti-colonial struggle, perforce, in order to draw large masses into the struggle, had to recognize the need for social equality. Those who were engaged in the social emancipation struggle benefited from the fact that the awakening created by the anti-colonial struggle brought large masses also to the social emancipation struggle. So that really these two struggles complemented one another. And I see the left movement in the country as being the legacy, in a sense, of both these struggles, because the left came out of both the anti-colonial struggle and the social emancipation struggle. Sometimes it came out of the social emancipation struggle via the anti-colonial struggle, sometimes the other way around. But fundamentally, the left in the country was a legacy of both these struggles. These struggles basically put forward before the people of this country an agenda of a democratic revolution. This agenda of a democratic revolution was something which was crystallized in the form of a resolution which was passed by the Karachi Congress in 1931. That resolution, which for the first time presented to the people by the anti-colonial struggle a picture of what free India, independent India would look like had remarkable features. One feature, of course, it had is equality before law, irrespective of gender, irrespective of caste, community, creed, language, and so on. It also put forward before the people the idea of universal adult franchise through elections to form your legislatures and the executive drawn out of the legislatures. I should say that the idea of universal adult franchise was adopted in Britain in 1928 for the first time when women got the vote. Do not forget that we are talking about the Karachi Congress resolution of 1931, which is really almost around that time. In France, universal adult franchise was used for the first time in 1945 at the end of the war. And in India, it was adopted in the constitution and, of course, implemented in the first election in 1952. So the idea of universal adult franchise, the notion of citizens with equal rights, a set of fundamental rights. Apart from that, the Karachi Congress even talked about abolition of death penalty, because the Karachi Congress resolution was adopted within a few days of the execution of Bhagat Singh, and as a result it put forward the abolition of death penalty, which to this day we have not done in the country. And what is more, when students of my university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, go and protest against the death penalty of Afzal Guru, they are branded to be seditious and anti-national. So the point is that the abolition of death penalty, free and compulsory primary education was something which was again promised in the Karachi Congress resolution, and also a level of economic security for all. So this, if you like, was in the 1930s a freedom charter that was put before the people. This freedom charter, in the context of the massive economic crisis that the Great Depression entailed, which brought great misery to the peasantry and small producers in the country, really brought large masses of people onto the freedom struggle. And therefore, this freedom charter is ultimately what took expression in the form of the Indian Constitution. And in my view, it constitutes the basic social contract on the basis of which modern India was founded. When I say social contract, I don't mean in the sense of the theories of social contract of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, but fundamentally the creation of the modern Indian state is something which is based upon a kind of social contract for which there was a freedom charter, and India is not the only country. This is the trajectory followed by large numbers of third world countries who were, in a sense, whose nationhood came out of the anti-colonial struggle, came out of their freedom struggle. Now this basically entailed a degree of social, economic and political equality. It promised a degree of social, political and economic equality. Ambedkar, while presenting the Constitution in his concluding address to the Constituent Assembly, had said that, look, this is a constitution which provides for political equality. But unless we actually move towards a socio-economic equality as well, you would find that this political equality would get subverted. And therefore, there was a kind of complementary movement which was required between the social, economic and political levels to realize this vision of a community of equal citizens that the Constitution presented before us. Now, the economic strategy that was adopted is something which was, in a fundamental sense, inimical to it. And the economic strategy meant the development of capitalism. And you can see my argument is that the development of capitalism, with capitalism having its own logic, own inner logic, its own immanent tendencies, this development of capitalism militates against the development of economic inequality, and consequently it actually aggravates social inequalities and threatens political equality, which is what we are seeing now. But the point is that for a very long time it was believed by Nehru and others that yes, while we can harness the energies of the capitalist class, we can control them. That the state can play a role of controlling the inequalizing tendencies which exist under capitalism. Capitalism, we all know, has inequalizing tendencies, but the assumption was that through state control, these inequalizing tendencies can be checked. And as a result, we had the development of a public sector, we had the vision of a socialistic pattern of society, all of which meant that the capitalists, while their constructive contributions could be harnessed, could be kept in check. There was a whole system of controls and regulations and so on, which these days are debunked, but on the other hand played a very important role in this conception that actually the immanent tendencies under capitalism towards growing inequality could be kept in check through them. Now already, however, during the Nehru period, even in the 50s itself, there was some suspicion that inequalities had begun, economic inequalities had begun to increase. Nehru, towards the end of his prime ministership, set up a committee headed by Professor Mahalanobis committee, to go into this question of whether wealth and income inequalities in India had actually increased during the period of the 50s. Therefore, there was some suspicion that economic inequalities were getting wider. But at the same time, they were not getting so much wider as to cause a great deal of concern. But at the same time, there is no doubt that the original promise of poverty being removed and so on were promises that were getting realized. As a result, large segments of the people were getting alienated from the development strategy, which was a strategy of planned development, which had been ushered in 1950s. There was a general feeling that really things are not going in a direction where you can see before your eyes the possibilities of the elimination of poverty. While this disaffection was taking place, at the same time, there was something happening in the international economy. And what was happening in the international economy is that the centralization of capital, a process which always happens under capitalism, had now brought to the fore enormous accumulations of finance which was trying to go global. As a result, you had the emergence of a globalized finance capital, finance going all over. And of course, in that particular situation, any kind of state restrictions were objected to, resisted by this enormous force of globalized capital. As a result, we know that the pressures to dismantle this economy of regulations and control and so on, which tried in some sense to restrict the inner tendencies, the inner logic of capitalism, this was something which culminated. It was growing through the 1980s and so on, but it culminated, as we know, in economic liberalization in India in 1991 and the pursuit of neoliberal policies. The neoliberal policies brought about at the economic level two fundamental changes, both arising from one simple fact, that while the earlier regime had tried to control the inner logic of capitalism, in some sense restrict the immanent tendencies of capitalism, neoliberalism gave them full play. Neoliberalism restored what I call the spontaneity of capitalism. It restored the tendency of capitalism to develop as its inner logic demands, instead of having really strong restrictions being placed by the state against the development of capitalism, development of the inner tendencies of capitalism. Now this, as I said, had two very important manifestations or implications. The first manifestation is that a whole sector of petty production that existed earlier and was protected by the state from encroachments by capital, that is peasant agriculture, fishermen, craftsmen, handloom weavers and so on, was now thrown open to encroachment by capital. As a result, while earlier multinational corporations, agribusiness were not directly allowed to reach the peasants. On the contrary, between them and the peasants, there was the state. The state played many roles, like, for instance, giving them subsidized credit. After bank nationalization, subsidized credit was made available, subsidized inputs were made available. You had the fixing of procurement prices, which were remunerative prices for a large number of crops. You had commercial crops whose price crashes were prevented through interventions by various commodity boards. You had the insulation of the domestic peasantry from the international price fluctuations through quantitative restrictions, tariff restrictions, and so on. You had public investment in irrigation and other areas relating to agriculture, research and development. You had extension services making available the fruits of research to the peasantry at large. So you had very many different ways in which peasant agriculture and petty production was sought to be protected. This was in line with the promise of the anti-colonial struggle. I mentioned that the anti-colonial struggle had really taken off in the 1930s because the peasantry was very badly hit by the Great Depression. You know, debts went up and you know, peasantry lost its land, its livelihood was squeezed and so on, terms of trade moved against it. That basically the peasantry had been badly hit by the Great Depression. The anti-colonial struggle drew massive peasant support on the argument that when free India comes, you would never again face this kind of a problem. And as a matter of fact, it is true that there are very many different ways in which the state came to support and sustain peasant agriculture and other petty production sectors. Like, you know, there was reservation as far as handlooms are concerned. Handloom weavers were not allowed to be removed by competition from milk crops. There were a whole lot of areas that were reserved for them, and so on. Now, this goes with neoliberalism. As a result, you have now a situation where subsidies are progressively withdrawn. Institutional credit to agriculture had dried up, because of which now they go to a new class of money lenders who give them credit at exorbitant rates. The assured remunerative prices are no longer made available to them. I'm not saying everybody benefited equally in the earlier regime, but nonetheless there was some protection. Now what you have is that protection is gone. You have agribusiness, international agribusiness and domestic monopoly capitalists reaching straight into the country, Monsanto reaching out to the peasants and even giving credit to them against the inputs they provide, etc. So you have a situation where now the peasantry is once more exposed to encroachment from the big capitalist sector. One implication of this, and this exposure to encroachment is what Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital. You now have primitive accumulation of capital once more opening up when it comes to the entire petty production sector. This primitive accumulation of capital takes the form of an income squeeze as far as the petty production sector is concerned, and it also takes the form of taking over the property of petty producers for a song for all kinds of projects, which are called development projects, but essentially projects at the helm of which are big capitalists. So effectively, big capitalists taking over petty producers' property, ostensibly by paying a compensation, but the compensation amounts to no more than a pittance, which is therefore a form of primitive accumulation of capital, is once more now present. At the same time, while primitive accumulation of capital dispossesses large segments or suppresses the incomes of large segments of petty producers, I'll give you one calculation which we made when I was in the planning board. If you take the fisheries sector of Kerala, attribute to every fisherman the statutory minimum wage of the state, then the entire sector is in deficit. Which basically means that the entire fisheries sector in the state survives because of the fact that the fishermen take a daily return that is lower than the statutory minimum wage of the state. So you can see the kind of squeeze that the petty production sector is actually facing. So this squeeze obviously means many of them would like to leave their traditional sectors. Many of them are leaving their traditional sectors. But on the other hand, if while leaving their traditional sectors, they could be absorbed into jobs created in the modern sector, no problem. That is what, after all, a transformation of the economy actually entails. And this is presumably what it is often claimed happened in Europe. Lots of people were removed from the petty production sector, and peasant agriculture was destroyed, but they were absorbed into the capitalist sector. And that if this was the case, just a transformation of the economy, nothing to worry about. This is what modernization is supposed to mean. But this is where the second aspect of neoliberalism comes in, and this aspect of neoliberalism has meant all restraints on structural and technological change are removed. Then now you can look at the number of cars, the variety of cars that we have, and the newer and newer varieties of cars, newer and newer models coming, so that you have a removal on all restraints on structural come technological change. Some still remain, but of course the attempt is to get rid of them. For instance, now the entry of multi-brand retail, which would mean that Walmart would come in and outcompete the petty traders in the country. So because of all this, what you find is the number of jobs being created, as is well known, in the modern capitalist sector of the economy are much less than even the rate of growth of the natural workforce, let alone the displaced petty producers and the peasants coming in. This is something which is general to capitalism. This is not something which is only special to our country. This is something which happened even in Europe, except that these problems in Europe were eliminated through large-scale migration of people from Europe itself to various temperate regions. As a result, the labor markets became tighter there, trade unions grew and so on, while that kind of possibility no longer exists in our case. There are no empty spaces, or there are no spaces which can be made empty of the local population by killing them or herding them into reservations in order for India's unemployed and underemployed to migrate to those regions. This basically implies that development under neoliberalism is accompanied by a massive increase in what Marx had called the reserve army of labor, which basically means unemployed, underemployed, disguised unemployed, intermittently employed, partially employed, casually employed, and a whole variety of such categories. And there is a huge growth in what one would call the reserve army of labor. If you have a growth of the reserve army of labor, then this has a number of very important implications. The first implication, which of course is a straightforward social implication, is the fact that there is a significant increase in the size of what is called the lumpen proletariat. And of course, an increase in the size of the lumpen proletariat is very conducive to growth of fascism, to growth of criminality, the growth of criminal politics, and so on, all of which we see in our country. The second thing is that the burgeoning reserve army of labor is the cause of growing income inequality. Why? Because if you have a huge growth in the reserve army of labor, this affects even the bargaining strength of those who are actually employed. Therefore, their real wages can't go up. And as labor productivity increases, therefore, the share of surplus increases. So when the share of surplus increases, while the share of the wage earners, and wage earners in the widest sense of the term, remains unchanged, you have ipso facto an increase in the level of income inequality. There is a study whose results were recently made available by Thomas Piketty and Chancel of France, two economists, about India. They use India's income tax data to find out what is the trend of income inequality in the country. Obviously, it requires some estimations, assumptions, and so on. Let's forget those. But fundamentally, they make this effort. Income tax in India was introduced in 1922. Therefore, they make a study from 22 onwards. In the early 1930s, the share of the top 1% of the population in the total income of the country was about 21%. Through the years, the share of the top 1%, according to them, drops to about 6% by the mid-1980s. Since then, they say that the share of this top 1% has increased, where it is now 22%, which is the highest ever since the introduction of income tax in India. In other words, in the last 100 years, the share of the top 1% has never been higher than it is today. And interestingly, this has occurred precisely in the period in which we have had the neoliberal economic policies. By the way, sometimes a distinction is not drawn between the earlier Nehruvian regime. By Nehruvian, I mean as a short form, the earlier dirigist regimes and the subsequent neoliberal regime. But there is a very significant difference between the two, and this is one of the manifestations. I agree that the earlier regime, because of its contradictions, opened the way for this new regime to come in, but the implications of this new regime must not be lost sight of in opposition to, in distinction from those of the earlier regime. So inequality has increased. Now everybody knows that wealth inequality is always greater than income inequality, because after all there's a huge mass of workers who earn income but whose wealth is zero. Therefore you'd find that wealth inequality is always much greater than income inequality. According to estimates about wealth inequality, which is now produced by Credit Suisse, which is an organization in Switzerland, you find that the top 1% of the population today in India owns about 60% of the country's total wealth. And this is rising. It's rising because in the last year, for which the study is available, additions to the wealth that went into the pockets of the top 1% was 73%. So if the additions at the margin are higher than the average, then as you know, the average itself is going up. So there has been a huge increase in income and wealth inequality, which is well known, which is talked about by everybody, and it owes its origin to this fact that on the one hand there's a huge squeeze as far as the traditional petty production sector, which employs most of the people in the country. Agriculture alone employs almost half the total workforce, and at the same time their absorption into the sectors which the modern capitalist sectors, that absorption is extremely limited. In fact, if you look at the period 2004-5 to 9-10, which are 2 years for which we have large sample, national sample survey data, a period in which growth rate was almost 8% per annum in GDP, the rate of increase in what is called usual status employment, those who consider being employed to be their usual status, was 0.8% per annum, which is way below the rate of population growth, the rate of workforce growth, let alone all those who are being dispossessed and who the dispossessed peasants, migrant peasants to towns and so on. The second thing which has happened is that precisely for this reason, the increase in inequality, the increase, you see, when you find that a dispossessed peasant, his income is being squeezed, moving to the towns, not getting adequate employment, therefore there has been a fall in his purchasing power. The state cannot do anything about negating this increase in inequality for the simple reason that in this neoliberal era, you cannot tax capitalists, then they would go out of your country. You have globalization of finance. Any state activism in the matter of taxing the rich would give rise to an outflow of capital, and therefore the state does not do that. On the contrary, as everybody knows, last few years in successive budgets, tax concessions have been given to the capitalists in order to draw more capital into the country, part of the Make in India campaign. So fiscally, you cannot rectify this. And at the same time, because you have to meet fiscal deficit targets and so on, there is a curtailment of public expenditure and an increasing privatization of essential services, education, health, and so on. If there's an increasing privatization of essential services, then healthcare actually becomes a very expensive business. If my son falls ill, suppose I'm a peasant and my son falls ill, I rush him to a hospital. That hospital is one in which if I go to a public hospital, he has to wait for 18 hours before a doctor can look at him, during which time who knows what may happen to his health. So perforce I take him to Max or Fortis or any of these hospitals, where the amount charged is so large that actually I have to go and borrow in order to meet the charges of my son. And when I borrow, I can't pay back, I get into debt. By the way, increasing health care costs is one of the most important reasons for peasant indebtedness, which has led to suicides by 300,000 peasants in the last 2 decades. There are numerous stories you must have seen. Recently, there was a story, horrendous story in Delhi about a couple who brought their child suffering from dengue fever to one of the hospitals in Delhi, one of these big hospitals. They had to sell their land. The child had to be hospitalized. They had to sell their land back home in order to pay for the hospital bill, and they could do so only for 19 days, after which the hospital left the child. Take the child because you have no more money. And the child died. So the parents lost their land and lost their child and lost all their assets. So these stories are very common. And this is actually what is happening. And because of all this, because of debt, you take debt and partly then you also start economizing on your consumption, particularly on your consumption of essential goods like food grains. As a result, you have a situation now where per capita food grain absorption is at a level which has gone down dramatically since the beginning of neoliberalism and is now at a level which is roughly comparable to where it was before the Second World War. As a matter of fact, if you look at long time series data, at the beginning of the 20th century, as we were learning yesterday from Utsa, that per capita food grain availability in what was then called British India was roughly about 200 kilograms per annum. By the time of independence, it had actually fallen to less than 140 kilograms per annum. With great difficulty, subsequently, the post-independence India, again during that period of dirigism or Nehruvian strategy, raised it to about 180 kilograms per annum in round figures by the end of the 1980s. Today, it is in the neighborhood of 165 kilograms. So you find that actually there is a decline in per capita food grain absorption. Since this absorption refers both to what is directly absorbed in the form of literally consuming food grains and indirectly absorbed through processed food, animal products and all the rest of it, it follows that all over the world, the tendency for direct or indirect per capita food grain absorption is to go up along with real income. In India, it has actually gone down, which actually suggests that there is an increase as far as poverty is concerned, defined as it is in India officially through a nutritional norm, something on which Utsav was talking yesterday. That if you take, for instance, 2,200 calories per person per day as the poverty norm and simply count the number of people who are below this, then you find, according to her figures, that in 1993-4, the percentage in rural India was about 58% and it goes up to about 68% by 2011-12. For urban India, the figure likewise is 57 and 65. So there is an increase in malnutrition, there's increase in poverty, which in India is defined through a nutritional norm. And as you all know from papers, that actually India today occupies the 100th position in terms of the hunger index among the 111 countries for whom this index is calculated, and India's position is going down. So in terms of economic inequality, the matters are pretty clear. In terms of social inequality, this has a direct bearing. We know that when you have a rise in income inequalities, since the people at the bottom are those who are also socially oppressed, while the people at the top are those who are socially, caste-wise and so on at a so-called higher level, then obviously an increase in income inequality per se implies an increase in social inequality. But there's something more. I'll just finish in 5 minutes. Something more. The second thing is the fact that those who earn the surplus, they spend it on something, they spend it on all kinds of services and so on. And we know there has been a burgeoning modern service sector in India, finance and hotels and all kinds of things. Now, many of these, and of course the IT-related services, these are sectors which obviously require a certain amount of skill, not high skill, nonetheless a certain amount of skill, and therefore they require a certain amount of education. Therefore, these sectors typically employ those who are already privileged in terms of their educational background. And in India, typically, it is the upper castes, those who are socially privileged, who also have access to education, greater access to education, and therefore their employment tends to increase. This would not happen if it was the case that you actually had reservations, which you earlier had in a number of areas. But as you know, with privatization, there is no reservation in the private sector. All this reservation is going to go. And what is more, with the state withdrawing from essential services like education, the accessibility as far as the poor and therefore the lower caste, so-called lower caste is concerned, socially oppressed groups are concerned, the accessibility to education that they have is something which goes down. Not only that, when you find that some jobs are opening up in the modern services sector, and some people, typically the more privileged people, socially privileged people have access to it, they have a vested interest. They develop a vested interest in preventing the underprivileged from having that access. Because if they did, then they have to compete against those who are from underprivileged backgrounds. And therefore, they have these slogans like, oh, look, government is pampering them and so on. Government should not pamper them. There should be fees and charge, all this business about lower fees, public education, government pampering the Muslims and the Dalits and so on is a bad thing. Therefore, they develop a vested interest. So casteism, or a revival, an intensification of casteism and communalism develops a new constituency, a powerful constituency in the era of neoliberalism. But that is also not all. When you find that, let us say, an upper caste boy gets employment, gets high salary and so on, well, the Dalit child does not, the upper caste child is not going to say that I got this as opposed to the Dalit child because I had the privilege of education and he did not. The upper caste child then says, I got it because I'm more talented. Therefore, the logic of capitalism, the so-called logic of capitalism that your material success depends upon talent, is then internalized and used by the socially privileged to argue that the socially underprivileged are untalented. They just don't have it in them, while we are the great, we have it in us and so on. Therefore, there is an enormous apparatus of caste and communal prejudice that gets built up under a neoliberal regime, which in turn then provides the constituency for the development of fascism as we see it today in a period of crisis when there are dangers that those who have been excluded and marginalized might revolt. The beneficiaries, particularly the big capital, then tends to use fascist movements, finance them, pour lots of money into their pockets in order to prevent any such possibility, to divide people along communal lines, to divide people along caste lines. And of course, there is one of the most remarkable features, something which Martha Nussbaum, the Chicago philosopher, had raised. How is it that in India, the educated people support the Hindutva party? Because in India, the educated people, or large segments of them, are beneficiaries of the neoliberal dispensation and develop casteist attitudes precisely for that reason, in a manner I've been talking about, and then they become votaries of Hindutva because they know that that way they can retain their privilege and their monopoly. It follows, therefore, on the basis of what I've been saying, that in India today, you have a situation where there is social retrogression. The promise of the Karachi resolution is not only being undermined, it's actually being rolled back. You actually have the open expression of casteist and communal prejudices. The notion of a fraternity of equal citizens is something which is completely now not even officially talked about. And consequently, you have social retrogression. But if you have social retrogression in a period, in a situation like ours, you cannot go back to the 18th century because this is going to generate resistance, rebellion as far as the deprived, the exploited, the excluded are concerned. When such resistance builds up, it can take the form, of course, of altering society for the better, of transcending neoliberal capitalism, of actually realizing, moving towards the Karachi Congress dream. But on the other hand, it can also take the form of all kinds of rival fascisms, all kinds of rival hatred campaigns, all kinds of, it can take the form of social disintegration. And of course, in either case, you would have a more and more authoritarian state. If it takes a progressive form, you would have an authoritarian state to generally suppress the progressive movement. If it takes the form of social disintegration, you would again have an authoritarian state in order, supposedly, to stem the social disintegration. Therefore, I think we now are in a world in which capitalism has brought us to a denouement where the democratic revolution is not only not being carried forward, not only not being arrested, but in fact is being rolled back. And I think because of that, it seems to me that the progress of democratic revolution in India, which is essential for this country's survival, requires a transcending of neoliberal capitalism. Thank you.
As someone once rightly said, you can jail the revolutionary, but you cannot jail the revolution. So thank you, sir, for that very enlightening session. Now towards the audience, if you have any questions for sir, you can please raise your hands so that our volunteers can reach you.
Sir,
Yes. Yes.
so what I get from your talk is that you are actually eulogizing the past, especially the Nehruian kind of economy, and condemning the present. And my question is then, what is the way forward? What is actually the concrete way forward for this crisis in capitalism? And my second question is then, actually Donald Trump and all other then developed nations leaders are saying now that then protectionism and statism is the way to regulate globalization. But actually they are in the past brought about globalization to the world, but now they are talking about regulations within globalization. And your comment about it?
Yes. Can I take two, 3, 4 questions together, because that'll just save time. Otherwise, if I answer, then someone may not get it. Yes, please.
So you said since the neoliberal policies, the inequality has increased and the richest 1% is holding 73% of the total asset of the country. So I just wanted to know whether there is a need for deviation from the development perspective, which we have been following all the governments, including the left government in Kerala. And I just want to know another question, what is happening right now in India, whether it is capitalism or whether it is crony capitalism, how Ambanis are growing and how Adanis are growing. And even Adani has setting up a special economic zone in Kerala.
Yes. Can I take a couple more questions, and then we can have a second round. Hello? If time permits.
Hello. Sir, my question is actually, our country is moving forward in a way that the poor or these people which are nothing because of our social system, earlier social system, now they are again marginalized. And the political party which is BJP kind, they are more into power, and they are accumulating money, and these Adani type such teams are getting all the money in their hand. And what will happen to our country in the next few years? Or these people again will get marginalized, they are nothing. And again the religion, the name of God has been used because you have to suffer, because it is your birth, suffering is your birthright, or by the suffering only you will become to God. Such things such lies has been used. What will happen to our country, sir? What is going to happen?
Yes, I think...
Sir, my question, what is the solution for this?
Okay. Okay. I think protectionism is one question. All right, let me begin by protectionism. You see, when you have protectionism basically means that I get a larger share of the existing market. That you were importing to my country, I prevent you from importing to my country, I grab that bit of the market. Protectionism does not give rise to an increase in the size of the market. Okay, so protectionism amounts to what economists call beggar thy neighbor policies. It amounts to my grabbing hold of the market at your expense. And therefore, protectionism, suppose Trump introduces, would then give rise to retaliation by other countries that would impose protectionism vis-a-vis American goods. And if you have all countries growing protectionist, while the world market as a whole does not increase, that will only aggravate the crisis. If protectionism was accompanied by an increase in world demand, the increase in world demand could come about, for instance, through larger government expenditures. Larger government expenditures, again, if they are financed by taxing workers, there is no increase in demand because the workers' consumption goes down, government expenditure goes up, no net increase in demand. World demand would increase, or within any country demand would increase if the government finances larger expenditure either by taxing the capitalists because then a lot of the tax comes out of savings, not by reducing expenditure, or if it is done through a fiscal deficit. Now we know that in the era in which capital is freely mobile, you can't tax capitalists because then capital would flow out of your country. You cannot have a fiscal deficit because then again capital doesn't like more large fiscal deficit, it will flow out of the country. People like Trump who talk of protectionism do not talk of capital controls. Please remember that. If they talked of capital controls, then it would mean that they are withdrawing from the current globalization. But protectionism in a world with capital controls is something that would only give rise to a worsening of the crisis, but is not going to resolve the capitalist crisis. All right. Now, the next question was whether it's, let me just make clear that when I say 73%, not that the top 1% holds 73% of the wealth. Top 1% holds about 60% of the wealth, but I said additions to the wealth in the last 1 year, for which we have data, that have gone to the top 1%. Okay, so we should be clear about that. Yes, everywhere, the state governments, of course, have limited kind of resources, and now with GST, even more limited. There's enormous centralization of economic powers that has taken place. The state governments are not in a position, really, at this moment, to pursue significantly different economic strategies. But even so, I would say that a left government cannot pursue, must not pursue, should not pursue identical economic strategy to what governments in Gujarat and elsewhere do. The left must experiment with something different. Okay, it can experiment. For instance, I'll give you an example. If you want to develop modern industry or to build a factory, then the factory can be built by getting rid of land, of peasants taking over their land, handing it to some Adani who then actually builds the factory. That is what I call primitive accumulation of capital. The alternative is to actually build the factory by getting a peasant cooperative, peasants and laborers cooperative, to become the owners of the factory themselves, in which case nobody has got dispossessed. Everybody's rights have, in some sense, been respected. Now, what I'm saying is that the left government should, in my view, experiment with these newer forms. To what extent they would succeed or not, I don't know. But left necessarily means looking at new possibilities. Okay? The left government must do that. Crony capitalism, I believe all capitalism is crony capitalism. There is no such thing as non-crony capitalism. In Britain, if you come from Oxford or Cambridge, you can actually get a loan quite easily from banks. In fact, it's quite amusing. There was a man working for the oldest English merchant bank, which is called the Baring Bank. That man actually was placed in Singapore, and he speculated with the Baring Bank's funds, so the bank went bankrupt. And how come he speculated with Baring Bank funds? Because he was from Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere, and in fact, therefore, he was supposed to be one of us. And if he's one of us, nobody really bothered to check whatever depredations he was making. So all capitalism everywhere is crony capitalism. So please do not think that there's some ethical capitalism where, strictly speaking, some rules of the game are followed. That's never the case. All right. Now, what will happen? I think that's a question which is a subtext in all the different questions. To my mind, exactly as my argument was saying, as long as neoliberal capitalism lasts, you are going to have a social disintegration, and you're going to have a very serious social situation, which we all know is happening in front of our eyes. Therefore, to get out of the social situation and the growing threat of fascism, it is very important that we also visualize a transcending of neoliberal capitalism. Now, transcending of neoliberal capitalism for what? I'm a socialist. Transcending of neoliberal capitalism in my eyes basically means having a socialist order. I don't want you to accept it. I don't want you to agree with me. But I want you to say that, all right, let us make sure that a certain minimum amount of reform in the people's conditions comes about. You talked about the marginalized. One possibility I'd suggest, let us say that certain very few, let's say 5 basic economic rights are guaranteed to every citizen, like we have political rights. A right to food, a right to employment, a right to quality, free, publicly funded education, a right to quality, free, publicly funded healthcare, and a right to old age pension and disability benefits. In which case, you're actually developing a notion of a citizenship. It accrues universally, it's justiciable. You acquire this right as a citizen of the country. The country can easily afford it because all of it wouldn't cost more than 10% of GDP. Our tax GDP ratio is about 16%. Even if all of it is financed by taxes, it goes up to 26%, which is nothing. Even America has that much of a tax GDP ratio. So why don't we don't accept my word that socialism is the answer. I believe it is. I believe even introducing this would actually bring you difficulties, the overcoming of which would take you towards socialism. That's what I believe. But on the other hand, whether you agree with me or not, let's all agree that let's just have a minimum agenda of reforms that revive the Karachi vision. There was some other question. Yes, please.
In this modern age, when we have totally forgotten the directive principles of state policy and its status in our constitution, how should we engage with that?
Okay. Any other questions?
Sir.
Yes, please.
So, sir, as you said, the opening up of agriculture sector has also resulted in rising inequality in income distribution. But, sir, have the failure in the proper implementation of the Green Revolution resulted in this economic inequality in agricultural sector?
Yeah. Any other question? Yes, yes, please.
So with the increasing kind of accumulation of wealth in a few hands and inequality increasing, and you said that when the government is actually implementing a policy to tax more, the funds are being flushed out of India and being deposited in foreign banks and other investments. So is there a possibility that this could be curbed by introducing a kind of limitation, a limit to the amount of fund to be transferred out that can be brought in, that kind of policy can be brought in to bring in a kind of a situation where equality can be more restored in not in the form of socialism or something like that, but it can be just that kind of increasing inequality can be brought down or curbed to a certain extent.
Yes. No, any other questions?
Since 1990s, when India opened up for the neoliberal forces. So my question is, since in the 1990s, when India opened up for the neoliberal forces, the left parties have been largely up and against the neoliberal capitalist forces. But on the ground level, are you satisfied in their performance? We saw in West Bengal how the government was forced to open up for certain factories, and we see even in Kerala certain development projects coming up. And we also would like to know your practical experience while you were the member of the Planning Commission in Kerala. How have your experience been? Is the left parties in a way being forced to open up the doors, or are they not quite easy to follow the kind of socialist philosophies that they believe in?
Let me just go. Directive principles of state policy are not being followed, and in fact my argument, for instance, I talked about having a set of economic rights. All of them can be derived from the directive principles of state policy. What happened when the Constitution was drafted is that political rights were included as fundamental rights. Economic rights were not included as fundamental rights. They were put in the directive principle. They were not binding. I think some of them must be made binding, and I was giving an illustration. So I agree with that. All right. Now, inequality in the yes, green revolution, we know, would have created inequality. Sheila Bhalla is there, Professor Sheila Bhalla, who's an expert on it, probably going to speak in the afternoon. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you take, I mean, I gave you some figures. Whatever the inequalities, there were inequalities. Mahalanobis committee was set up, I told you, there were inequalities even in the earlier period. But in the neoliberal period, there has been a dramatic increase in inequality. Okay, and that is something for which I gave you some figures. So one has to distinguish between the inequalities that were taking place earlier, which of course were, but they were within certain bounded, there were some bounds upon it, but the inequality is taking place now. And let's also be very clear that, the rural rich, the amount of money they have is peanuts compared to the amount of money that the urban rich have. So when you have inequalities of the latter kind, the urban rich becoming richer, it has a phenomenal impact. There are so many billionaires now from India in the list of billionaires in the country. Okay, I think there's two very important questions. One is the question of taxing more. I said that I believe that going beyond neoliberal capitalism would push you towards socialism. Now, I said you don't have to accept it. But why do I believe this? Let me explain my argument, which I don't want you to accept. As you said, let us say that we have to give these minimum rights, 10% of GDP. You start taxing the rich, naturally they are the only ones who can pay. When you tax them, capital would flow out. When capital flows out, you are going to have an economic crisis, financial crisis. Therefore, you'll have to put controls. As you said, curb. Capital controls then become necessary. You have already started withdrawing from neoliberalism. When you put capital controls, then Mr. Trump is going to say, this is a rogue state. Let us put sanctions against this state, as they are now doing against Venezuela. That let's put sanctions against this state because it is actually putting capital controls. Therefore, there will be sanctions against you. Then you'll have to have trade controls. Okay. And if you have capital control and trade controls, you have to develop your domestic production. How do you develop the domestic production? Capitalists are now going to invest heavily in such a situation. Public sector would have to play a role, cooperatives would have to play a role, and therefore one thing leads to another. And once you try breaking out of neoliberal capitalism, the dialectics of that would carry you towards socialism. That's what I believe. But let us agree on the need to break out of the constraints of neoliberal capitalism. The last question is left parties and so on. As I said earlier, that yes, left parties have been consistent opponents of neoliberalism. But on the other hand, left parties, wherever they have been in power, Bengal here, even Tripura, there's an enormous middle class pressure that development basically implies create jobs for the middle class by inviting IT sector, multinationals and so on, setting up factories, etc. All of which is perfectly legitimate. But in a situation where you do not have enough resources on the part of the state, in a situation where either the state government is not able to invest itself or get cooperatives or other forms of investment going, perforce they start doing exactly the same thing as Gujarat is doing. Invite the Adanis, invite the Ambanis, invite multinationals to come. That's what West Bengal did, invite the Tatas to set up a kind of automobile plant and so on. So fundamentally, the left would fall into the same trap, whatever its ideological positions, as any other state government, unless it innovates new ways of bringing about development. And therefore, I think there's an enormous need today for the left to innovate on new kinds of development strategy. That's what. Thank you.
I thank you, sir, for enlightening our minds and broadening our thoughts through your excellent talk. As a token of love and appreciation, we wish to hand over a memento to you, sir. I cordially invite Sri P.P. Ravindran, the former director of School of Letters, Mahatma Gandhi University, to hand over the memento. I also request you, sir, to receive the same. Thank you.